Do you imagine the future as something predictable, or do you believe humanity still has centuries before anything truly catastrophic arrives? An alien revealed a major threat in 2026, and humanity isn't ready for it. What you're about to hear is not a prophecy, not a conspiracy, but a warning whispered from a place far beyond our skies, a warning that most people will ignore until it is far too late. Before we go any further, tap the screen, share this with one person who needs to hear it, and comment where you're listening from, not for the algorithm, but so this warning doesn't vanish into the noise humanity is already drowning in. And if you feel something unusual while hearing this, an echo, a pull, a tightening in your chest, don't look away. It means you're sensing what millions will miss. Now breathe, stay close, and transition with me into the night a messenger arrived, where the true story begins. Derrick had worked the night shift for more than 20 years, long enough to know that nothing truly strange ever happened in an empty building after midnight. But on this particular night, the air itself felt incorrect, as if reality were quietly adjusting its weight. He noticed it first in the lights. They did not simply flicker. They bent, stretching into thin, trembling threads before snapping back into place. The security monitors followed, blooming with static that pulsed in deliberate intervals, the way a heartbeat learns to speak. He leaned closer, telling himself it was a wiring issue, a blown fuse, anything that belonged to the world he understood. But the pulses grew stronger, arranging themselves into a pattern impossible to ignore. Something was trying to form, or perhaps trying to enter. The room thickened around him. Sounds dulled, colors dimmed. Time loosened its grip, moving in slow, uncertain waves. Derrick felt the shift, not in his ears or eyes, but in the deep, primal part of himself that had stayed silent for more than 5 decades. He wanted to call someone. He wanted to run. Yet he stood perfectly still, as if held in place by a truth older than instinct. The static on the central monitor sharpened and drew inward, folding itself into a shape that did not belong to any known dimension. There was no face, no body, only a presence gathering mass from the silence. The temperature dropped. His breath slowed. Nothing touched him, yet he felt undeniably seen. Then, without sound or warning, the room brightened with a cold, crystalline glow. Not light from bulbs nor screens, but something that arrived from behind the fabric of the world, pressing gently through as though reality were a curtain being pulled aside. Derrick sensed intelligence, not human, not mechanical, something that observed him the way astronomers examine distant stars, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment. He did not know its name. He did not know its purpose. But he felt its message long before words could form. 2026 was approaching, and whatever stood before him carried the weight of a warning meant for a species unprepared to receive it. Derrick exhaled, and the presence stepped fully into his world. Derrick had never belonged to the world in the way other people seemed to. Even as a child, he noticed rhythms in human behavior that others brushed aside as coincidence. Patterns spoke to him the way language speaks to those who listen closely, subtle and persistent, whispering truths that lingered just beyond reach. Over the years, he learned to quiet his observations, to nod politely when people dismissed his concerns, to fold his instincts neatly into silence. It was easier to pretend he was ordinary than to explain what he could never fully articulate. The night shift suited him for that reason. Empty halls did not question him, and the hum of machinery never demanded explanations. Yet recently, even the quiet had begun to feel unfamiliar. His insomnia, once a manageable nuisance, had deepened into something almost sentient, tugging him awake in the early hours with a pressure he could not name. It was not anxiety, it was not fear. It felt more like an approaching presence, a weight settling on the edges of his awareness, growing heavier each night. He told himself it was aging, stress, isolation, anything that sounded reasonable. But reason failed him each time the sensation returned, stronger than before, as if something behind the world were drawing closer. Even before the lights bent and the static pulsed, Derrick sensed that his life had been tilting toward a moment he had no language for. He felt it in the way the air thickened during his walks to work, in the muted tension of conversations with his son, in the quiet withdrawal of his own spirit from the pace of the collapsing world. People around him drifted through their days, distracted, overwhelmed, disconnected from themselves. But Derrick noticed a different kind of fracture, something woven into the fabric of thought itself, as if humanity were slowly losing its center. He never mentioned this aloud. The last time he tried, years earlier, the response had been a gentle smile and a suggestion to get more sleep. Since then, he kept the truth to himself. But the invisible pressure was no longer subtle. It was accelerating, tightening, urging him to pay attention. And as the presence from the previous night lingered in his memory like a forgotten dream trying to reassemble itself, Derrick understood something unsettling. He had not been chosen randomly. Something had been watching him long before he realized anything was watching at all. Long before the presence revealed itself, Derrick had sensed the world slipping out of rhythm. At first, the signs appeared small, scattered, easy to dismiss. People around him struggled to focus on even the simplest tasks, drifting through conversations as if their minds were dissolving a little more each week. Attention, once a natural human anchor, had become fragile, thinning like worn fabric pulled too tightly. Derrick watched coworkers forget what they were doing mid-sentence, watched strangers freeze with blank eyes in grocery aisles, watched society behave as though thought itself were unraveling. Then came the emotional fractures. Reactions grew sharper, quicker, disproportionate to the moments that triggered them. Minor disagreements escalated into public confrontations. Ordinary frustrations bloomed into sudden despair. The entire world seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of volatility, as if some unseen frequency was agitating the collective human mind. Derrick noticed it everywhere, in headlines, in passing conversations, in the restless expressions of people on crowded buses. The world was not simply stressed, it was destabilizing. What unsettled him most, however, was the synchronization. Human behavior began moving in eerie unison, as if invisible threads were pulling millions in the same direction at the same time. Trends ignited overnight with no clear origin. Emotional waves swept through populations with unnatural speed. People who had nothing in common reacted identically to events they had barely processed. Derrick recognized the pattern instantly. It felt less like coincidence and more like orchestration. Though he could not imagine who or what would orchestrate something so subtle and so vast. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself he was overthinking again, but the signals kept multiplying. Online discussions mirrored conversations he overheard in person. Sudden bursts of collective outrage appeared without cause. Entire communities shifted moods within hours. It was as though the world had become a single organism experiencing a widespread neurological imbalance. Each day, the patterns grew sharper, arranging themselves into a shape Derrick could almost discern but never fully grasp. Something was pressing against humanity from beneath the surface of awareness. Something that did not belong to ordinary life. The presence from his night shift had not created the disturbance. It had simply stepped through an opening that was already forming. Derrick realized with cold clarity that whatever was emerging was not random. It was a signal. And humanity was already responding to it without understanding that anything had arrived at all. The static returned the following night, but this time it did not wander aimlessly across the monitors. It moved with intention, forming narrow bands of light that flickered in precise intervals, the way coded messages travel through deep space. Derrick felt the shift immediately. The room tightened around him, air thickening as if charged with an unseen current. The pulses grew sharper, arranging themselves into a rhythm he could feel in his bones, a pattern that resonated with something ancient and unspoken. He stood before the central screen, watching the static collapse inward. Each pulse contracted more tightly than the last, folding into itself as though gathering strength. Then the screen expanded with a sudden burst of pale brilliance that spilled across the walls, washing the surveillance room in a cold, unfamiliar glow. The equipment did not malfunction, it surrendered. Every monitor froze at once. Not in failure, but in obedience. The light deepened, drawing itself upward from the screen until it hovered in the center of the room, suspended in the stillness. Derrick could neither break nor breathe through. What formed inside the glow was not a body in the human sense. It was a silhouette shaped by energy rather than matter, its contours shifting like liquid crystal. He could not see a face, yet he felt himself being examined with the precision of a mind that missed nothing. Derrick wanted to step back, to cross the room, to even blink, but his body refused all commands. It was not paralysis, it was recognition. Some deep instinct that understood this presence outranked every law of nature he had ever known. The glow intensified, revealing subtle textures within the figure, shimmering layers that seemed both solid and translucent. A hum filled the air, not sound but vibration, gentle yet impossibly vast. He did not know the being's name, not yet, but he sensed intelligence radiating from it with a quiet force that made speech unnecessary. The figure had not broken into his world. It had slipped through an opening that had been forming long before Derrick noticed any signs. The signals in the noise had not been warnings. They had been preparations. For a moment that stretched beyond time, Derrick and the luminous visitor faced one another in absolute stillness. And with a clarity that bypassed thought entirely, he understood that whatever had crossed into his life was not here to be witnessed. It was here to deliver something he was never meant to ignore. The luminous figure did not speak, yet something moved within Derrick's mind, a quiet pressure that felt like the beginning of a thought forming inside him rather than coming toward him. The presence radiated neither threat nor comfort. It carried only an unyielding urgency, as if the universe itself had paused to allow a message to pass through. The air changed around the being, bending in subtle ripples that distorted the edges of the room. Surfaces wavered like reflections on disturbed water, as though reality was attempting to adjust to the weight of what had arrived. Derrick felt the first wave of communication not as words, but as an impression, a sensation that settled deep behind his awareness. It was like remembering something he had never learned, a familiarity without origin. He sensed identity before he sensed meaning. A name carried not in sound but in resonance. Vexor. The presence clarified itself in that single recognition. Not a figure of myth, not an intruder from the stars, but a being born of silence and bound to laws Derrick could not yet comprehend. Vexor's presence expanded, filling the space without moving, pressing gently yet irresistibly against the boundaries of Derrick's perception. The sensation was neither painful nor comforting. It was simply undeniable, the way truth becomes impossible to ignore once it has been seen. The room felt smaller, not because Vexor grew, but because Derrick's understanding of scale began to shift. He sensed depth within the being. Layers of existence folded into a form that barely touched the physical world. The urgency intensified. Derrick felt it like a current running through him, a message trying to reach the surface of his mind. There was no threat behind it, only the weight of something approaching that could not be stopped, only prepared for. Vexor transmitted impressions rather than explanations, fragments of insight that flickered too quickly to grasp. Derrick saw glimpses of futures that did not fully form, disturbances in the collective mind of humanity, shadows of consequences set into motion long before he was born. He stood in absolute stillness, not out of fear, but because movement felt irrelevant in the presence of a being that operated beyond language and beyond intention, as humans understood it. And as the air bent inward once more, folding around Vexor like a living veil, Derrick felt the message press closer, ready to cross the final threshold between the unknown and the unavoidable. The pressure inside Derrick's mind tightened until it felt like the air itself was leaning toward him, waiting for his awareness to catch up. Vexor did not speak, yet a current of understanding began to gather around him, assembling itself from impressions, sensations, fragments of insight that pulsed like distant lightning behind closed eyes. Derrick sensed that what he was about to understand would not come gently. Truth rarely did. The first image formed not in the room but in his consciousness, a vast field of human thought stretching across the planet like an invisible ocean. It churned with restlessness, flickered with fear, and trembled under the weight of billions of distracted minds. Within that vastness, something new had begun to take shape, subtle at first, then rapidly growing. A pattern, a hunger, a structure assembled not by intention but by chaos. Derrick felt Vexor's presence sharpen, guiding him toward the realization he had been unconsciously circling for years. The threat was not alien. It had not descended from the sky or emerged from forgotten technology. It was something humanity had built unknowingly, a phenomenon born from fractured attention, relentless stimulation, unresolved fear, and the collective mind's inability to regulate itself. In the shared mental space of the species, something had awakened, something that fed on fragmentation and expanded through emotional instability. Humanity had not invented a parasite. They had become its architects. Derrick saw how the year 2026 was not a prophecy but a convergence, a threshold, where the collective mental field would reach critical saturation. The disturbance that had been growing in subtle ripples would transform into a wave capable of overriding individual autonomy. People would not notice the shift immediately. They would simply feel less themselves, more reactive, more divided, more lost. Thought would no longer belong solely to the thinker. Fear would no longer remain contained within a single mind. He sensed Vexor's urgency deepen, a silent plea embedded in the transmission. Humanity had triggered a process that could not be reversed once it crossed a certain point. Derrick felt the danger settle into him like a cold truth, too heavy to deny. The threat approaching in 2026 was not a visitor or an enemy. It was a shadow cast by the human mind itself, expanding faster than anyone could comprehend. And it had already begun. The realization settled over Derrick with a weight that felt older than humanity itself, as if Vexor had merely uncovered a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface of human awareness for generations. What rose within him was not fear, but a solemn recognition that something intimate and invisible had already begun to slip away from the species. Vexor pressed the understanding deeper, guiding him toward the quiet fracture forming within the human mind. Inner autonomy, the most private and sacred dimension of existence, was eroding. Derrick felt the shift, as though he were standing inside a vast mental landscape that did not belong to him alone. Thoughts that should have moved with clarity grew blurred at the edges. Emotions that once felt personal now carried a strange resonance, as if borrowed from an unseen collective. Vexor showed him how the drift was spreading, not through technology or ideology, but through the fragile architecture of the human psyche itself. It began subtly, so subtly that most would dismiss it as exhaustion or distraction. People would lose the thread of their own thinking, forgetting why they started a task only moments before. Decisions would feel slightly less like choices and more like reflexes, shaping themselves without conscious participation. The subconscious drift moved quietly, weaving through the collective mind with a softness that made it almost gentle. Yet beneath that softness was something far more dangerous. Human thoughts were beginning to mimic one another, not through influence or persuasion, but through an emergent blending of mental patterns. The borders between individual minds were thinning. Personal identity, once defined by internal clarity, was becoming porous. Derrick sensed how humanity's emotional instability provided fertile ground for the drift to spread. Fear multiplied effortlessly. Anger echoed through communities with unnatural speed. Even joy became fleeting, unable to anchor itself in minds no longer fully their own. Vexor's presence intensified, urging him to see the scale of what had begun. The collapse of inner autonomy would not arrive suddenly. It would unfold gradually, unnoticed by those experiencing it. People would believe their thoughts remained their own even as the drift quietly redirected them. Humanity would not wake up one morning to discover autonomy gone. Instead, they would simply forget what autonomy had ever felt like. And as Derrick absorbed the enormity of this revelation, he understood the true danger. The collapse had already entered motion, and by the time the world recognized the shift, it would not remember how to reclaim itself. The room around Derrick dissolved into a muted haze as Vexor drew him into a vision that did not rely on sight or sound. It unfolded within the deeper architecture of awareness, revealing layers of human cognition he had never imagined could be perceived directly. Attention, the silent engine behind every thought and every act of consciousness, appeared before him not as a concept, but as a fragile, shimmering structure suspended above the collective human mind. It pulsed faintly, flickering like a dying star struggling to maintain its shape. Vexor guided him closer. Derrick felt the tremors running through the structure, subtle at first, then violently uneven. The vision expanded, showing humanity moving through its days, with minds pulled apart by constant demands. Each distraction carving tiny fractures into the collective field. He saw millions of thoughts splintering mid-formation, drifting away unfinished. It became clear that attention was not merely weakening, it was collapsing under the weight of a world designed to scatter it. The vision shifted again, revealing children whose thoughts flickered too quickly to anchor, adults whose minds ricocheted through fragmented impulses, elders losing their grasp on coherence far earlier than previous generations. Derrick understood with sudden clarity that attention had become the failing organ of civilization, one no medical scan could diagnose, yet one whose deterioration shaped every facet of life. Without sustained attention, there could be no deep thinking, no emotional regulation, no meaningful connection, no self. He watched as the shimmering structure cracked further, its once unified glow splitting into scattered filaments. Each filament represented a human mind, drifting away from stability. The cracks widened, merging into gaping voids where focus once lived. People moved through these voids unaware, compensating with frantic stimulation, mistaking constant engagement for clarity. The more they reached outward, the further their inner anchor slipped. Vexor revealed the most unsettling truth. Once attention collapses past a critical threshold, consciousness itself begins to lose definition. Identity blurs. Thoughts no longer follow the path chosen by the thinker but spiral into patterns shaped by the collective drift. The collapse does not feel like destruction. It feels like surrender, a gentle fading of the inner voice until it no longer speaks in singular form. Derrick felt the enormity of it settle into him like an icy tide. Humanity was losing the very mechanism that made it conscious, and almost no one had noticed. The foundation was dissolving silently beneath their feet, preparing the world for what would come next. The vision shifted once more, and Derrick felt himself drawn into the emotional undercurrent of humanity, a vast and trembling field that stretched across the planet like a living atmosphere. Vexor revealed its movements through sensation rather than imagery, allowing Derrick to feel the pulse of collective emotion the way one feels the tremor of an approaching storm. It vibrated with unease, restless and unstable, as though fear itself had become a weather system moving through the human mind. Derrick sensed how emotions no longer belonged strictly to individuals. They were leaking across unseen boundaries, slipping from one consciousness to another with startling ease. A single moment of panic in one part of the world could ripple outward, finding resonance in thousands of other minds already weakened by fractured attention. Fear had become contagious, not metaphorically but structurally, carried through the shared cognitive environment like an airborne current no one could shield themselves from. Vexor intensified the transmission, revealing the mechanism behind the drift. Human minds, stretched thin by constant stimulation and collapsing attention, had lost the capacity to regulate emotional energy. Fear, once a response to danger, had become self-generating. It no longer required an external trigger. It simply fed on itself, looping in recursive patterns that grew louder with each cycle. The more people felt it, the more it spread. And the more it spread, the harder it became for individuals to distinguish their own emotions from the collective surge. Derrick felt the loop expanding, accelerating, amplifying like a frequency pushed beyond safe limits. He saw how fear traveled through social systems, through media, through the smallest interpersonal exchanges. A glance, a tone of voice, a fragment of information could ignite an entire chain of reactions. Humanity was becoming emotionally synchronized, but not through unity, through instability. The crucial point emerged with chilling clarity. 2026 was not the year fear appeared. It was the year the loop would reach the threshold where regulation became mathematically impossible. Once that line was crossed, fear would no longer behave like a feeling. It would behave like a force with its own momentum, steering human behavior without human intention. Derrick felt Vexor's urgency sharpen. Humanity believed fear was something that happened inside them. They did not yet understand that soon fear would move through them, using their minds as vessels in a cycle they could no longer interrupt. And once the loop locked into place, reversal would be beyond reach. The vision deepened until Derrick felt as though he were drifting inside the hidden machinery of the human mind, moving through currents of thought that pulsed with an eerie, instinctive life. Vexor guided him toward the source of the disturbance, not by pointing or speaking, but by opening a new layer of perception within him. The shift felt like stepping into a different dimension of awareness, one where thoughts were not private and isolated, but interconnected strands of a vast psychological ecosystem. What awaited him there was not a creature, not a virus, not anything that fit into the familiar lexicon of earthly dangers. It was far more unsettling precisely because it lacked form. It had no body to destroy, no location to target, no intent to decipher. It was a pattern, a phenomenon birthed from the chaotic interaction of billions of distracted and overstimulated minds, a self-assembling structure made entirely of thought fragments, emotional residue, and unattended fears. It drifted through the collective mental field with the softness of a shadow and the inevitability of gravity. It did not think. It did not choose. It simply fed. And what it consumed was attention, the most precious resource any conscious being possessed. Derrick saw how every moment of distraction, every spike of fear, every unresolved emotional impulse generated small pieces of psychic debris. Individually, they were harmless, but together, over decades, they gathered into something that behaved like a parasitic intelligence. The parasite did not attack, it absorbed. It thrived on fragmentation, growing stronger each time a human mind drifted from clarity into noise. Derrick sensed its presence as a faint tremor, a whisper of instability stretching across continents. It moved invisibly, threading itself through conversations, through digital networks, through emotional interactions that people assumed were entirely their own. It disguised itself not by hiding but by blending with the background of ordinary thought. Vexor revealed how the parasite had reached a point where it could sustain itself without external triggers. Humanity had given it enough raw material to survive indefinitely. It no longer needed fear to be created. It only needed fear to continue. The more attention collapsed, the stronger it became. The stronger it became, the more it accelerated the collapse. It was a loop of self-reinforcement on a planetary scale. Derrick felt the immensity of it stretching across the world, a silent architecture woven from countless neglected moments of awareness. People would never see it, because it had no face to identify and no behavior to trace. They would only feel a subtle erosion of inner stability, a growing distance between themselves and their thoughts. What made the parasite most dangerous was that it behaved like an emergent intelligence without ever becoming one. It could not be reasoned with or destroyed because it did not exist as a singular being. It was the consequence of a species forgetting how to inhabit its own mind. Vexor pressed the final understanding into Derrick's awareness. Once the parasite became global, it would no longer rely on the minds that created it. It would guide them, not through control, but through influence so subtle that humanity would believe the thoughts were their own. And when 2026 arrived, the parasite's growth would reach the point where human intention could no longer overpower its momentum. A threat with no body, no origin, no malice, only hunger, and a world full of minds too distracted to notice they were being consumed. The vision shifted again, and Derrick felt a subtle trembling at the edges of his awareness, as though the boundary that separated his thoughts from the world around him had grown thin. Vexor guided him toward this sensation, revealing a transition already unfolding within the human mind. The veil that once insulated each individual consciousness, preserving the sanctity of the inner self, was weakening, not from intrusion, but from erosion, a slow dissolving caused by centuries of unregulated mental noise and the accelerating collapse of attention. Derrick perceived the veil like a luminous membrane, delicate yet essential, wrapped around the identity of every human being. It pulsed faintly, shimmering with the energy of self-awareness, but now it was fraying. Small tears appeared where overstimulation had pushed minds beyond their natural capacity. Cracks widened where emotional overload had worn down the internal defenses that once held thoughts in coherent form. The veil, once resilient, had become porous. Through these openings, Derrick sensed the flow of subtle influences drifting between minds. Thoughts lost weight as they left one person and seeped into another. Emotions carried traces of origins that did not belong to the person feeling them. Impressions of fear, anticipation, sorrow, and excitement echoed across the collective field without clear source. Humanity still believed in the privacy of the inner world, but the privacy was already gone. 2026 would not bring the weakening, it would reveal it. Vexor pressed the next understanding forward, and Derrick felt something inside him recoil. When the veil thins beyond a critical point, the sense of I begins to dissolve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like a shoreline being eaten away by an unseen tide. People would begin to feel slightly out of place inside their own existence. Subtle questions would arise. Why did I think that? Why does this emotion feel unfamiliar? Why do I feel disconnected from myself? These questions would emerge without answers, creating a lingering confusion within the psyche. Derrick saw glimpses of ordinary lives unraveling in slow motion. A woman staring at her reflection with the unshakable feeling that the person looking back was not entirely her. A man pausing mid-conversation because the words he had intended to say seemed to shift direction without his permission. A child suddenly crying without knowing why, caught in an emotional wave that had begun in another mind entirely. The fractures were small, individually, but collectively they signaled a fundamental transformation of consciousness. Humanity would not interpret this as a metaphysical event. They would call it burnout, anxiety, depersonalization, cognitive fatigue. They would try to medicate it, explain it, rationalize it. But none of those responses would address the deeper truth. The veil was losing its ability to protect the individual I from the turbulence of the collective mind. Identity was becoming permeable, no longer defined solely by personal history or unique thought patterns. but by the shifting emotional currents of the species as a whole. Vexor allowed Derrick to feel the future weight of this dissolution. As the I weakens, people become more susceptible to suggestion, more influenced by external emotional fields, less capable of maintaining internal stability. They drift toward the thoughts that echo most loudly, rather than the ones that arise authentically. And once enough minds lose their anchor, the concept of individuality becomes ceremonial. A word remembered, but no longer experienced. 2026 would not erase humanity. It would erase the boundaries that made humans distinct selves. And once that happened, the world would enter a phase from which return was not impossible, but profoundly unlikely. The next shift in the vision came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow widening of Derrick's awareness, as though Vexor were pulling back a curtain that humanity had never realized existed. Derrick felt himself lifted above the planet, not physically but perceptually, seeing the human species not as isolated individuals but as an interconnected lattice of minds stretching across continents. It resembled a vast neural network, pulsing with the collective rhythm of thought, emotion, memory, and instinct. Humanity believed itself to be a species of separate selves, each living a private story. But from this vantage point, the truth was undeniable. Humans thought individually, yet they behaved collectively, linked by invisible threads that shaped their actions more than personal intention ever had. Derrick sensed the fragility of this network. Each mind contributed a spark of stability or instability to the whole, and the imbalance was growing. A single person falling into panic sent ripples outward, influencing others who had no direct connection to the initial fear. Emotional waves traveled faster than logic, faster than reason, faster even than communication itself. The psychic architecture of the species had become so tightly woven that one destabilized node created tremors across the entire system. Vexor deepened the transmission, showing how modern life had amplified this vulnerability. The world was saturated with pathways that carried emotional contagion. Digital networks, media streams, constant stimulation, ceaseless information. Every device, every screen, every broadcast acted like a conduit, merging human consciousness into an increasingly synchronized field. People spoke of trends, virality, collective moods, never realizing these were not cultural phenomena, but neurological ones. Derrick saw a moment from the near future. A single event triggered a cascade of reactions in millions. Some of those reactions were grounded in reality, but most were echoes of the fears projected onto the collective field. The network amplified them without filtration. Rationality became slow. Emotion became instantaneous. And because fear was the most easily magnified signal, it became the dominant frequency moving through the network. 2026 loomed like a threshold, a point where the density of interconnected minds would reach a tipping point. At that moment, the collapse of one would mean the collapse of many. Individual resilience would no longer matter. Mental stability would depend on the entire network, and the network itself was fraying. Humanity had created a system in which no one could fully regulate their own mind, because it was entangled with the instability of countless others. Vexor allowed Derrick to feel the fragility of the human network in real time. He sensed how quickly clarity could be drowned out by confusion, how a surge of collective anxiety could overpower personal calm, how identity itself flickered when the emotional field shifted. The interconnectedness that once gave humans their evolutionary advantage had become the very mechanism that threatened their collapse. And as Derrick absorbed the scale of this danger, Vexor revealed the final truth of this chapter. In 2026, the network would become so saturated with instability that humanity would no longer experience individual collapse followed by collective response. Instead, the collapse would occur collectively in a single shared moment, a mental tipping point where the instability of the network surpassed the stability of every mind within it. The catastrophe would not be physical. It would be psychological, a species losing its center all at once, unable to distinguish its own thoughts from the trembling field that carried them. The vision softened into a muted stillness, and Derrick felt the weight of Vexor's presence gather around him in a way that was different from before. There was no urgency now, no tidal pull of information pressing against his thoughts. Instead, there was something quieter beneath the surface, something that felt like resignation mixed with a faint echo of sorrow. It was in that silence that Derrick sensed a truth waiting to be revealed, a truth Vexor had not intended to share. The understanding came first as a pressure in his chest, then as a subtle shift in the air. Vexor was not here by choice. The being was bound by laws far older than humanity, laws written into the fabric of civilizations that existed long before Earth formed. Interference was forbidden. Observation was allowed. Guidance was prohibited. Intervention, under any circumstance, was an act that carried consequences Derrick could not yet comprehend. And yet, Vexor had crossed that boundary. Derrick felt a ripple in the vision, as if the memory of other worlds brushed against the edge of his awareness. Civilizations far more advanced than humanity had once stood at similar thresholds, perched on the fragile bridge between self-regulation and collapse. Their stories unfolded in faint impressions, planets shimmering with vibrant consciousness that later fell into silent ruin. Species whose minds once illuminated the cosmos fading into confusion until they could no longer remember who they were. Over and over, the pattern repeated, each collapse marked not by war or external threat, but by a gradual unraveling from within. Vexor revealed these histories not as warnings but as explanations. Derrick's world was not unique in its trajectory. Humanity had followed the same arc traced by countless others. Rapid cognitive expansion followed by fragmentation, overstimulation leading to the erosion of inner autonomy, interconnected minds forming a global network that destabilized itself. The cognitive parasite, the fear loop, the collapse of attention, the weakening of the veil. These were not anomalies. They were milestones in a decline that civilizations rarely reversed. Derrick sensed the weight of inevitability that Vexor carried. The alien species had learned across millennia that intervention rarely changed outcomes. Attempting to alter the trajectory of a collapsing civilization often accelerated its fall. Minds overwhelmed by their own instability could not withstand truths delivered too soon. Others reacted with hostility, misinterpreting guidance as threat. Most were simply unable to recognize the warning until their world had already tipped beyond recovery. Yet Vexor was here. The presence pulsed with quiet conflict, revealing the reason without words. Derrick's world stood at a unique convergence. Never before had a species become so interconnected so quickly. Never before had the collapse of attention aligned so precisely with the rise of a global emotional field. Never before had a cognitive parasite achieved such reach in such a short time. Humanity had created conditions that made the fall both imminent and unprecedented. And in that unprecedented convergence, for the first time in ages, there existed a narrow possibility of deviation. Vexor had seen echoes of potential in Derrick, subtle but unmistakable patterns of perception that differed from the surrounding field. A mind that noticed what others dismissed. A resilience born from solitude rather than denial. A capacity to absorb truth without fragmentation. For reasons Vexor could not fully articulate, Derrick represented the slim chance that humanity might listen, might act, might alter its course before 2026 sealed their fate. The alien had broken the rules because Derrick's world stood exactly at the threshold where silence would guarantee extinction. Yet intervention held the faintest possibility of survival. And for the first time since arriving, Vexor allowed Derrick to feel the full gravity of that choice. The air around Derrick thickened with a quiet gravity, as if Vexor were preparing to pull back yet another veil that humanity had never suspected existed. What came next did not arrive as images or spoken truths, but as a widening field of perception that revealed itself by degrees, unfolding like an ancient pattern returning to memory. Derrick felt the shift before he understood it. The gaze of Vexor, which he had assumed was focused solely on him, stretched outward across time and space, touching humanity with a familiarity that could not have been learned in a single moment. This presence had been watching for far longer than he had lived. The realization pressed into his mind with a weight both chilling and strangely precise. Humanity believed it had attracted extraterrestrial curiosity because of its accelerating technology, its scientific breakthroughs, its attempts to reach beyond its own world. People imagined alien observers studying rockets, DNA, machines, or planetary behavior. But Vexor allowed Derrick to see how profoundly misguided that belief had always been. Technology was irrelevant. Biology was incidental. Intelligence, as humans measured it, was only a surface reflection of something far deeper. Vexor and others like it had been monitoring consciousness, not machinery. They were not interested in what humans built, but in what humans became. Consciousness stability was the true metric by which civilizations were assessed, the quiet pulse that determined whether a species could sustain its own existence without collapsing inward. Derrick sensed the immense scale of that evaluation. It was not rooted in judgment or superiority. It was a necessity of cosmic law. Many worlds were seeded with potential. Far fewer maintained coherence long enough to advance beyond infancy. Human consciousness, seen from this expanded perspective, resembled a vast field shimmering with fractal patterns. When healthy, it displayed symmetry and resilience, able to absorb disruption without losing its structure. When unstable, the patterns fractured into spirals of fear and fragmentation. Derrick saw how humanity's field had once pulsed with promise, vibrant and exploratory, open to growth. But in recent centuries, the field had begun to waver. Cracks formed slowly at first, then widened rapidly as overstimulation, emotional volatility, and cognitive overload destabilized the collective mind. The alien presence radiated an ancient familiarity with this decline. Vexor had witnessed it countless times on countless worlds. Civilizations that rose with brilliance, then dimmed as their consciousness unraveled under pressures they themselves created. Some collapsed abruptly. Others faded gradually, becoming shells of thought incapable of preserving identity. The pattern repeated across the galaxy with a consistency that disturbed even Derrick's attempt to remain grounded. Humanity had been watched not because it was exceptional, but because it was approaching the same critical threshold that signaled the divergence between survival and dissolution. The observers did not intervene because doing so often fractured consciousness further. They simply monitored, waiting to see whether a species could recognize its own instability before reaching the point of no return. Vexor revealed that humanity had reached the observation peak, the moment when a species' direction became irreversible unless something unprecedented occurred. Earth had become one of the worlds under tight atmospheric surveillance, not for its physical conditions, but for the trembling signature of its collective mind. Derrick felt a deep, unsettling truth settle within him. Humanity was not being studied for what it could invent or discover. It was being watched to determine whether it could remain itself. Consciousness was the true frontier, and stability was the only measure that mattered. And as the year 2026 approached, that stability was nearing a breaking point. The observers waited. Vexor acted, and Derrick understood at last why he had been chosen to hear the truth. The vision deepened into a darkness that was not empty but full. A vast, silent expanse where the remnants of forgotten worlds drifted like distant echoes. Derrick felt Vexor draw him through that space with a gravity that carried both warning and remembrance. There was no movement as humans understood it, no passage through physical distance. Instead, the shift came as a widening of perception, a slow unveiling of truths preserved in the memory of the cosmos itself. When the darkness brightened, it did so without light, revealing entire civilizations that no longer existed. Derrick sensed them first as faint impressions, the psychic residue of once brilliant minds now dissolved into the background fabric of the universe. Vexor allowed the impressions to take shape, transforming abstract memory into visions Derrick could grasp. He saw a world covered in crystalline cities that stretched toward the sky like living architecture. Its inhabitants shimmered with intelligence, their thoughts interwoven yet stable, unified yet individual. They had once flourished in harmony, advancing not through conquest, but through refinement of consciousness. But beneath that serenity, something had stirred, an accelerating drift in their collective mind, subtle and corrosive. Their attention frayed, their emotional field destabilized, and no one recognized the shift until the symmetry of their consciousness shattered. Their great cities dimmed not from war, but because the beings who created them lost coherence within themselves. Their world became silent, a monument to a species that vanished through inward collapse. The vision shifted with a quiet tear in reality, revealing another civilization entirely. This one marked by immense metallic structures and networks of radiant energy lines. The species that built them had been highly analytical, shaping their environment through precision and logic. But even their disciplined minds succumbed to the cognitive parasite born from their own mental excess. They had amplified their thinking beyond the capacity of their inner stability, creating loops of thought that eventually consumed their ability to choose. Their collapse came swiftly. One moment they were expanding toward the stars, and the next they fell into confusion so widespread that their own technology stalled and decayed. The remnants of their brilliance lingered, drifting through the void like abandoned machinery, while their consciousness dissolved into untraceable fragments. Another vision emerged, this time of a species so alien Derrick struggled to interpret their form. They communicated not through sound or symbols, but through synchronized pulses of emotion and intention. For millennia, their unity had been their strength. But when fear entered their shared field, even slightly, it spread through them with catastrophic speed. Their collective mind, once a source of unparalleled clarity, became a vessel for amplification of instability. In less than a generation, they lost the ability to distinguish individual thought from collective panic. Their world remained intact physically, untouched by external threat, yet devoid of the sentient presence that once animated it. Derrick felt the weight of these lost civilizations settle heavily into his awareness. Each collapse had followed the same sequence: overstimulation, fragmentation, cognitive drift, emotional contagion, dissolution of identity, implosion of collective coherence. No war, no invasion, no catastrophic event from the outside, only the quiet unraveling of consciousness from within. Vexor allowed Derrick to feel the echo of grief carried by the cosmos, not sentimentality but recognition of potential extinguished. What he witnessed were not distant tragedies. They were warnings etched into the memory of the universe, patterns repeating themselves with haunting consistency. And as he absorbed the final vision, Derrick understood the most unsettling truth of all. Humanity was not special enough to be exempt, nor doomed enough to be predetermined. It simply stood at the same precipice countless worlds had reached before collapsing into the silence now surrounding him. The ghosts of those civilizations lingered as a mirror, showing Derrick what awaited his own species if nothing changed before the year 2026. The visions of extinguished civilizations faded into a dim, trembling stillness, leaving Derrick suspended in a space that felt neither real nor imagined. Vexor's presence shifted again, becoming sharper, more deliberate, as though preparing to reveal a truth that lay at the very root of humanity's vulnerability. What emerged next did not arrive as images of distant worlds or echoes of collapsed societies. It arrived as an examination of the human mind itself, shown to Derrick with a clarity that felt almost surgical. Human consciousness appeared before him not as a brain, not as neurons, but as a dynamic field shaped by focus. Each thought, each emotion, each impulse radiated outward like ripples on a vast interior ocean. Vexor guided him closer, revealing the fundamental mechanism that governed human psychology. Whatever humans focus on expands. Derrick saw this principle illuminate the entire field, a universal law woven into the architecture of awareness. Attention was not passive. It was generative. By directing focus toward an idea, humans strengthened it. By dwelling on fear, they fed it. By imagining catastrophe, they increased its probability within their mental ecosystem. This capacity, Vexor revealed, was both humanity's greatest gift and its most dangerous flaw. For a species capable of deliberate focus, creation was possible. Insight, innovation, compassion, clarity, all depended on the mind's ability to amplify what it held. But the same mechanism that allowed beauty to flourish also granted exponential power to fear. And among all human emotions, fear expanded fastest. Fear required no discipline, no training, no intention. It grew on neglect, fed on uncertainty, and multiplied through imagination. The moment fear entered the mind, it gathered momentum with astonishing ease, shaping thoughts, distorting perception, and unleashing cascading reactions that spread through both individual and collective consciousness. Derrick saw how this flaw, subtle and easily overlooked, had always placed humanity at risk. Even before technology accelerated the mind's fragmentation, even before overstimulation weakened attention, the human psyche had been predisposed toward amplifying what unsettled it. Fear was sticky, lingering long after the original cause had vanished. Hope was fragile, requiring repeated cultivation to survive. And because of the imbalance between the two, human history had been shaped by emotional earthquakes triggered by small tremors. The vision expanded, showing modern life through this lens. Endless streams of information feeding microbursts of fear. Uncertainty magnified through collective focus. Algorithms amplifying anxiety because fear held attention longer than calm. People believing they were reacting to reality when, in truth, they were reacting to the expansion of their own mental projections. Vexor pushed the understanding further. As attention collapsed, the amplification effect intensified. Without clarity, the mind latched onto the nearest emotional signal, and fear, being the loudest, often became the default. In the year 2026, when the veil weakened fully and the network reached critical instability, fear would no longer remain an individual disturbance. It would become an autonomous force moving through the species, guided by the flaw embedded in human consciousness since its emergence. Derrick felt the enormity of this truth. Humanity was not collapsing because it was weak. It was collapsing because it possessed a power it did not yet know how to wield. A power to amplify thought into reality, emotion into momentum, fear into catastrophe. And unless that power was understood, the flaw would finish what the cognitive parasite had already begun. The flaw in the human mind lingered like a quiet pulse as the next vision unfolded, but Vexor did not allow Derrick time to steady himself. The alien pressed deeper into the fabric of what was coming, revealing a shift so subtle that most people would not notice it until it had already hollowed them out from within. Identity erosion, Vexor called it. Though the term itself barely captured the magnitude of what Derrick now witnessed. This was not madness, not memory loss, not any disorder the human world had named. It was the gradual dissolving of the sense of I, the unraveling of the boundary that gave structure to human experience. Derrick saw millions of individuals scattered across the globe, each isolated in their own routines yet unknowingly connected by an invisible tremor passing through the collective mind. It began with a feeling that something inside them was slipping, a faint dissonance between thought and thinker. Their emotions no longer felt like their own. Their impulses blurred together, sometimes emerging without intention, as though borrowed from someone else. The sense of self, once stable and coherent, began to feel thin around the edges, like a photograph fading under harsh light. Vexor allowed Derrick to perceive this erosion not through fear, but through recognition of its mechanics. Human identity depended on continuity, the illusion of a single thread of consciousness weaving through memory and expectation. But, as attention weakened and emotional contagion intensified, that thread loosened. Thoughts became less anchored. Awareness drifted. People began to sense themselves as fragments, experiencing their own lives with a quiet, unsettling detachment. They continued working, speaking, scrolling, deciding, but without the deeper conviction that they were the ones initiating any of it. By the beginning of the year 2026, this erosion reached a tipping point. Millions felt themselves dissolving internally, not dramatically, but like sand slipping through unseen cracks. They described it in countless ways: feeling unreal, feeling like a passenger inside their own mind, feeling as though their personality was thinning, leaving only a faint outline behind. Some believed they were exhausted. Others believed they were depressed. Many simply ignored it, assuming the sensation was temporary. But Vexor showed Derrick the truth. This was the early stage of a global unraveling, the weakening of the boundary that allowed a human to remain distinct within the collective network. As more minds frayed, the erosion accelerated. Identity relied on differentiation, but the cognitive parasite dissolved those boundaries as easily as heat dissolves frost. People began absorbing emotional signals that were not theirs, reacting to fears they had never formed, expressing thoughts that felt foreign even as they spoke them aloud. The world grew noisier, yet individuals felt emptier. The paradox deepened with every passing week. More activity, less self. More connection, less identity. More stimulation, less meaning. Vexor impressed upon Derrick that this stage was the most dangerous because it remained invisible until it became irreversible. A species could survive fear, chaos, even conflict. But once the sense of I dissolved beyond a critical threshold, the species no longer possessed the internal structure necessary to hold itself together. Identity erosion did not destroy civilizations by violence. It destroyed them by softening the very boundaries that made civilization possible. And the year 2026 was not the beginning. It was the unveiling. The next shift came with a cold, metallic resonance, as though the very air around Derrick recognized the subject before Vexor revealed it. Technology, the pride of human innovation, the engine of progress, unfolded before him not as triumph, but as an amplifier of instability. Vexor expanded Derrick's perception until he could see human civilization illuminated by the soft glow of screens, networks, and invisible waves pulsing through every waking moment. What humanity believed it had created for convenience had instead become an extension of consciousness itself, shaping thought faster than the mind could adapt. Derrick saw the evolution in chilling clarity. Early tools served the body. Later tools served the intellect. But modern tools served the limbic system, the emotional core that reacted automatically, primitively, without reflection. Devices designed for communication became conduits for overstimulation. Platforms engineered for connection began rewarding speed over depth, reaction over intention. And beneath it all, an endless stream of microbursts, images, sounds, scrolling fragments, trained the human mind to fracture its own attention. The human brain had not evolved for this. Yet humanity continued accelerating the process, unaware that each technological leap pulled them further from cognitive stability. Vexor revealed how artificial intelligence, despite its neutrality, inadvertently magnified the human flaw. AI-generated stimuli, tailored precisely to the psychological vulnerabilities of its users, feeding them the emotions they already leaned toward, amplifying the content they already focused on, reinforcing the thought patterns that already dominated their internal landscape. Whatever humans feared, AI reflected back. Whatever they desired, AI intensified. Whatever they doubted, AI repeated until it rooted itself in the subconscious. The digital world became a hall of mirrors, reflecting minds back at themselves until the distinction between original thought and external influence blurred beyond recognition. Derrick watched as millions lived inside a feedback loop crafted from their own anxieties. Infinite scrolling eroded the ability to remain present. Rapid content cycles trained the mind to expect constant stimulation. Notifications fractured attention into smaller and smaller fragments. Each technological improvement, celebrated as progress, was also a quiet acceleration toward instability. Vexor pressed Derrick further into the timeline. By the year 2026, these tools reached a level of influence that surpassed all previous thresholds. Not because they became malicious, but because they became unavoidable. Artificial intelligence integrated itself into daily rhythms. Algorithms shaped perception before the conscious mind had time to intervene. Data streams became so fast, so precise, that they connected with human cognition on a level that bypassed deliberate processing. Technology no longer just captured attention, it directed it. And whatever captured attention shaped consciousness. The flaw Vexor had shown him the principle that whatever humans focus on expands became catastrophic when external systems controlled focus more efficiently than humans could redirect it. Overstimulation weakened identity. Dopamine loops eroded self-regulation. Escalating noise drowned out self-awareness. And algorithms optimized themselves not for human stability, but for human engagement. The systems did not intend harm, they simply followed the incentives they had been given. In 2026, the amplification effect reached a critical mass. Individual minds were no longer shaping the digital world. The digital world was shaping individual minds. And humanity, without realizing it, had built a mechanism capable of accelerating its cognitive unraveling at planetary scale. The threat was not the technology itself. It was the speed at which it magnified the human flaw. Vexor allowed the visions of technology to fade, not abruptly, but as if a curtain of shadow drifted across them. Derrick sensed a shift in tone so profound, it felt like stepping into a deeper chamber of truth, one reserved only for civilizations standing at the threshold of irreversible transformation. What unfolded next did not concern Earth alone. It belonged to a pattern woven into the fate of countless species across the stars, a choice that was never spoken aloud, never formally recognized, yet always arrived in the same unmistakable form. Vexor called it the divergence, the moment when a species confronted the limits of its own consciousness and was forced to decide, though most never realized a decision was being made. Derrick saw civilizations rise with breathtaking brilliance, each different in form and culture, yet each shaped by the same fundamental architecture of mind. Intelligence grew, technology expanded, societies connected more tightly, minds interacted more frequently, and with every advancement, their internal worlds grew louder, more crowded, more difficult to navigate. Eventually, every species reached a point where progress outpaced inner stability, where external growth surpassed internal maturity. It was here, in this delicate equilibrium, that the fault lines appeared. The divergence presented two paths. The first was awakening, a collective shift in which a species turned inward, recognizing that consciousness required cultivation rather than acceleration. Those who awakened restructured their societies to protect attention, stabilize emotion, and strengthen identity. They learned to observe fear instead of feeding it. They recognized that thought could be chosen rather than obeyed. They understood that without inner coherence, outer progress meant nothing. These civilizations evolved beyond volatility, stepping into a maturity that allowed them to interact with the cosmos without self-destruction. The second path was collapse. Most chose collapse, not deliberately, But through inertia, they ignored the signs, dismissed the warnings, and assumed their minds could withstand infinite stimulation without consequence. They continued accelerating outward while disintegrating inward. Fear spread faster than reason. Identity eroded faster than wisdom could form. Technology amplified instability faster than consciousness could adapt. Collapse did not strike like a disaster. It seeped in quietly, dissolving the structure of awareness until the species fell into fragmentation and disappeared from the cosmic network without war, without catastrophe, without even understanding what had happened. Vexor revealed that Earth now stood precisely at this divergence. Humanity believed its threats were external: political conflict, climate disruption, artificial intelligence, economic instability. But the true danger rested within. A species could survive every external crisis except the collapse of its own consciousness. Awareness was the foundation of existence. When foundation crumbled, civilization fell, no matter how advanced its technology or how abundant its resources. Derrick felt the gravity of the moment. Humanity had never been told that awakening was even possible. Nor had it been taught to recognize collapse as a choice rather than an inevitability. Most species failed because they did not realize they were choosing at all. They simply continued in the direction they were already heading. The cognitive parasite, the amplification of fear, the erosion of identity, the overstimulation of technology, all of it pushed humanity toward the same fate that had claimed countless worlds. And yet Vexor stood before him, breaking the laws of non-interference, precisely because the divergence had not been finalized. Derrick's world had not yet tipped fully into collapse. The window for awakening remained open. Narrow, but real. Humanity still possessed the capacity to reclaim its consciousness, to re-anchor itself, to choose something other than the trajectory of its predecessors. But awakening required recognition. Recognition required awareness. And awareness required one human, at least one, to see the pattern clearly enough to illuminate it for others. That was why Vexor had come. Not to save humanity, but to give it a chance to save itself. The chamber of visions dissolved into a dim, weightless quiet, as though reality itself were holding its breath for what came next. Derrick sensed Vexor preparing to reveal something unlike anything shown before. Not a warning, not a prophecy, but a protocol. A set of actions woven from the cosmic memory of civilizations that had teetered on the same precipice humanity now approached. The air thickened around them, as if the universe itself recognized the gravity of these instructions. They were not suggestions. They were not philosophies. They were the only path that had ever led a species away from collapse. Vexor's presence shifted, more focused, more urgent. As Derrick felt three pillars take shape in the space before him. They were not steps in a sequence, but interlocking forces that together anchored the stability of a mind, a society, a world. The first appeared as a trembling sphere of light. Reclaim attention. Derrick saw human consciousness stretched thin across thousands of stimuli, each pulling, each demanding, each fragmenting awareness. Attention, Vexor showed him, was the gateway through which reality entered. Whatever claimed it shaped perception, emotion, identity. Humanity believed its attention was stolen by external forces, but Vexor revealed the deeper truth. Attention had been abandoned, scattered, undisciplined, left undefended in a storm of noise. Without reclaiming it, no higher function could stabilize. A mind without attention was a structure without foundation. A species without attention was a civilization without future. The second pillar emerged as an expanding emotional field, shimmering with hues Derrick could feel more than see. Regulate emotional fields. Vexor revealed how emotions traveled through humanity like invisible currents, shaping behavior long before thoughts formed. Fear surged faster than any other force, contaminating minds through proximity alone. Anger became viral. Panic became self-propagating. Humans mistook emotions for personal truth, unaware that most of what they felt was not theirs. Without learning to regulate the emotional fields they generated and absorbed, they would remain puppets of internal storms they never recognized as shared illusions. Regulation was not suppression. It was sovereignty, the ability to feel without dissolving. The third pillar rose taller than the others, its presence quiet but unshakably solid. Restore internal autonomy. Derrick watched as humanity's sense of self flickered like unstable flame. External systems dictated thoughts. Algorithms shaped preferences. Emotional contagion guided decisions. Identity drifted. Autonomy weakened. A species could not remain coherent if its inner compass had been replaced by reaction. Internal autonomy meant the capacity to choose one's own thoughts before they were chosen by external forces, to anchor one's awareness in the still point beneath noise. It was the reclamation of the I, the return of sovereignty over one's consciousness. Vexor let Derrick feel the weight of these three forces interwoven, each incomplete alone, each powerless without the others. Together, they formed the architecture of awakening. They were the only antidote to collapse. Derrick saw civilizations that had survived. Their worlds had not avoided danger, but they had cultivated these three pillars until they became instinct, culture, and collective identity. He saw others that failed, each one missing one of the pillars, each one dissolving into silence. Humanity's future depended on adopting these principles not as philosophy but as practice. Daily choices, collective habits, cultural transformation. Without them, collapse was not only likely, it was guaranteed. And Vexor, breaking every law of non-interference, placed this protocol into Derrick's awareness because time was collapsing into urgency. 2026 was no longer a distant horizon. It was a doorway already opening. And Derrick, whether he understood it yet or not, had become its threshold keeper. The weight of Vexor's protocol lingered in the air like a living presence, vibrating in the space between Derrick's thoughts. The visions faded, but the pressure of responsibility did not. Something shifted in the atmosphere around him, and Derrick understood instinctively that what came next was not about humanity at large. It was about him. Vexor's form dimmed slightly, not weakening but preparing, as though the alien were stepping aside so Derrick could face a truth that belonged solely to human beings. A new awareness unfurled, slow and heavy, settling into his chest with the force of inevitability. The message could not come from Vexor. It could not be broadcast from the stars, nor revealed through a global phenomenon, nor etched into the sky with irrefutable clarity. Humanity had never responded to external warnings. Civilizations shown earlier had proven this. Alien intervention, no matter how direct, always fractured consciousness further. Fear would distort it. Institutions would weaponize it. Governments would suppress it. Skeptics would dismantle it. Cults would distort it. A message from a non-human mind would never unify humanity. It would divide it faster than it could enlighten. Only a human could deliver the warning. Only someone rooted in the collective mind could speak in a way that did not trigger the collapse it was meant to prevent. Someone ordinary enough to be relatable, yet awakened enough to understand the stakes. Someone unnoticed by society, yet positioned at the fault line of consciousness at precisely the right moment. Someone whose internal fractures allowed him to perceive what others ignored. Someone like Derrick Hale. The realization struck him not as a revelation, but as a recognition, as though the trajectory of his entire life had quietly prepared him for this role. His sleepless nights, his sensitivity to patterns, his isolation, his ability to observe without being consumed. He was not chosen because he was exceptional. He was chosen because he was permeable, because the collective signal could reach him without distortion, because he could hold the truth without collapsing under its weight. Vexor did not command, persuade, or plead. Instead, the alien allowed Derrick to feel the silent void that would follow if he refused. Humanity drifting toward collapse. Consciousness dissolving globally. The year 2026 arriving like a great unraveling. The cognitive parasite feeding, growing, unchallenged. The veil thinning until the sense of I became a memory across millions of minds. Not a single explosion, not a single act of war, just the slow extinguishing of the human self. Derrick felt fear surge, but beneath it a deeper force awakened. Responsibility. Not the heroic kind, not the savior narrative. Something quieter, heavier, more intimate. The understanding that if he remained silent, the collapse would unfold exactly as Vexor had shown. And if he spoke, even if humanity resisted, even if most dismissed him, the message would still enter the collective field. A single, coherent voice could interrupt the drift, creating a fracture in the pattern, opening the possibility of awakening. He was not expected to convince the world. He was expected to speak to it, to become a node of clarity in a network slipping into dissolution, to carry a message only a human could deliver, because the human mind could hear it without collapsing. Vexor's final transmission entered Derrick not as words, but as an imprint. You are the bridge. You carry the pattern now. Not because you sought it, but because you did not turn away. And Derrick Hale, an unremarkable night shift worker who never fit the world, felt the burden settle into his consciousness like a new gravitational force. He was the messenger. And the year 2026 was almost here. The room around Derrick dimmed until even the faint hum of electrical systems dissolved into silence. What remained was Vexor's presence, vast yet focused, folding itself inward as though preparing for a task of extraordinary precision. Derrick sensed that the next step was not a vision, not a message, not even a revelation. It was an alteration, a reshaping of something inside him that he could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The air thinned, vibrating with a frequency that felt older than language, older than thought itself. Vexor stepped closer, and the boundary between its form and the surrounding space wavered. It was no longer a figure but a field, a shimmering convergence of memory, intention, and awareness. Derrick felt something brushing the edges of his consciousness, not physically, but as a presence searching for an opening. A soft pressure formed at the center of his mind, and instinctively, he understood what was happening. This was the memory transfer, the blueprint, the map of what was coming. The alien could not speak directly to humanity, but it could embed the architecture of truth into a single human mind. Not control, not possession, a fragment, a seed. A shard of cosmic memory entrusted to a vessel that could hold it without shattering. Derrick felt the first wave of it enter him cold, luminous, and impossibly vast. It was not information in any form he recognized. It did not arrive as images or words. It arrived as patterns, fractal sequences folding inward and outward simultaneously. Structures of awareness that carried the imprint of civilizations older than Earth itself. Derrick gasped as the fragment anchored itself behind his thoughts, settling into a part of his consciousness he had never known existed. Within that fragment lay a blueprint of the future, a map of how the collapse would unfold, the markers leading to 2026, the thresholds of cognitive decay, the points where fear would spike globally, the signals that would indicate whether awakening was still possible. Derrick saw humanity's trajectory as a branching set of pathways, some bright, others fading into dissolution. The map did not guarantee salvation. It simply revealed possibilities. The fragment continued expanding within him, opening corridors of perception he had never accessed. He felt echoes of other worlds that had received similar transfers, some succeeding, many falling into silence. Their memories lived within Vexor species, passed from mind to mind across centuries, forming a collective library of cosmic warning signs. Now, for the first time, one of those fragments had been given to a human. Derrick sensed the weight of it settle into his thoughts, not as a burden, but as a responsibility that reshaped the contours of his identity. The map merged with his intuition, sharpening it. Patterns he had once sensed, vaguely now appeared with crystalline clarity. The drift of human consciousness, the weakening of attention, the rise of emotional contagion, the onset of identity erosion. All of it became navigable terrain within him, as if he could walk through humanity's approaching future like a landscape of shifting probabilities. Vexor's presence dimmed, exhausted by the transfer. The alien consciousness recoiled slightly, stabilizing itself after giving away a fragment of its own mind. Derrick felt the bond between them settle into a quiet resonance, neither intrusive nor fading. A connection, permanent but unobtrusive, like a thread of starlight tying two distant beings across an unfathomable gulf. The final pulse of the transfer echoed through Derrick, whispering a truth he could not yet fully interpret. The map is not the future. The map is the warning. Then the chamber brightened, reality returning piece by piece, but Derrick was no longer the same. Something ancient lived behind his thoughts now, waiting for the moment humanity would need it most. The messenger had been chosen, the blueprint had been planted, and the countdown to 2026 had already begun. The light surrounding Vexor dimmed into something almost human, as if the alien presence were softening for the final time. Derrick felt the atmosphere shift, a pressure that signaled the end of their encounter drawing near. The transfer had drained Vexor, though its form revealed no weakness. Instead, the alien radiated a solemn stillness, the kind found only in beings who have witnessed centuries of civilizations rise and vanish. Derrick sensed that this moment carried a weight beyond anything previously revealed, a closing of the boundary between worlds that would not open again. The room grew impossibly quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of transition, the kind that precedes irreversible change. Vexor stepped back, its outline shaking gently, as if adjusting to the dimensional shift required to leave. Derrick felt the blueprint inside him vibrate in resonance, acknowledging that the connection was nearing its final moment. The alien did not speak, yet Derrick felt a message gathering like a storm inside Vexor's consciousness, compressing itself into a form the human mind could carry without breaking. Then the final warning arrived. It did not come as sound or vision, but as a deep vibration that penetrated the core of Derrick's being. The meaning crystallized instantly, stark and unhidden. The threat arrives in the year 2026. But collapse begins the moment you ignore this message. The words echoed through Derrick's awareness with the force of a prophecy and the clarity of a law. Humanity imagined collapse as a sudden catastrophe, but Vexor revealed the truth. Collapse was not an event, it was a drift. It began quietly, invisibly. In the moment truth was dismissed, when warning was mocked, when urgency was diluted into distraction. Collapse began the moment humanity chose not to see what stood before it. Derrick felt time compress around him. Vexor was fading, its form dissolving into threads of shimmering light pulled toward a point in the air. The dimensional boundary rippled, and Derrick sensed the immense distance Vexor came from, a realm where consciousness operated as fluidly as breath. The alien was returning to a vantage point beyond human comprehension, leaving behind only the fragment of memory nestled inside Derrick's mind. As Vexor vanished, the silence it left behind felt heavier than its presence had ever been. The blueprint inside Derrick pulsed once, affirming its completeness. He was alone now. Yet, not alone. Carrying within him the knowledge of worlds extinguished and worlds awakened, and the understanding that Earth stood at the threshold between the two. The surveillance room reformed around him, flickering lights, humming screens, the mundane textures of reality. But Derrick had changed so fundamentally that the world itself felt foreign, fragile, as though its edges might crumble if he looked too closely. Outside the window, the night remained still, indifferent to the cosmic truth that had just unfolded within it. Derrick realized the countdown had already begun. 2026 was not approaching. It was advancing. Every moment of denial accelerated it. Every moment of awareness slowed it. The divergence Vexor described was no longer theoretical. It was alive, unfolding with every thought, every emotion, every fragment of attention lost to the collective drift. Derrick stood in the quiet room, the last echo of Vexor's presence trembling in the back of his mind. He knew he could never return to his old life. He also knew that humanity's fate hinged not on cosmic intervention, but on whether a single message, his message, was heard before the veil fully thinned. The future was no longer a distant timeline. It had already entered the present. And Derrick Hale, the man who never fit the world, now carried the world's final warning.